This past week, a new book, Brian Lenihan in Calm and Crisis, was launched. It's published by the Marion Press and it's edited by Brian Murphy, Mary O'Rourke and Noel Whelan. Each of them contribute an essay on the Brian Lenihan that they remember, as do 17 others.
And are you conscious, Brian, that your mother is also widowed? In a sense, people can sometimes forget that.
This is from a Miriam Meets programme with Miriam O'Callaghan, with Mary O'Rourke and Brian Lenihan, just some short period before his health crisis.
Because you're so busy in your own life doing what you have to do?
Yes, I know it is the case, and my mother has coped very, very well. But it is difficult. I mean, it's something that women do more than men, of course, because we tend to die first, and it's always interesting to hear women discuss it because clearly there are far more widows than widowers in life, and. It is. My mother has many interests, and later in her own life, while my father was alive, she went back and did a degree in arts and history, and then he died young, and I think. And Mary had the same experience, of course. Her husband died by modern standards at a young age when he was in his mid-60s, I think. Yeah. Same as my own father. And that's an especially difficult experience with people living longer and longer nowadays. And of course, the survivor then is going to live for quite a while, please God, Mary. In your case, you're hale and hearty. I mean,
well, thank God.
You don't look your age and all Aaron at all, and you certainly don't think your age. You keep us all up to the mark in the house.
And your parents had a tragedy, which I didn't know about until I read it last night, which is that you had a 5-year-old brother, didn't you, who died of leukemia?
Yeah, I was 6 when he died. Yeah, so in a way, I would have remembered him well, apart from my own parents. And in those days, there wasn't much treatment for leukemia. The medical nursing personnel were fantastic. He was in Crumlin, obviously, and it went on for about a year. And I remember it very, very well, of course. And I always remember at Christmas time, the Christmas before he died, some relatives bought him a Scalextric set, which in the Ireland of 1964 was an extraordinary present. Like, this was something you just dreamed that people in America had, even if your father was a senior politician or whatever. And he looked at it and he had no interest in it at all. You know, it's almost as if he had a premonition that the things of this world were not going to be for him. That memory always stayed with me of a very young child who realised something was wrong. And my mother had a similar experience with him when he turned to her and said, you know, there's something wrong, Mummy.
Oh, sorry, now it upset you.
And he passed away the day my son was born. So there was God took and God gave.
And Brian Lenihan was quite upset during that interview, as Miriam O'Callaghan mentioned there. She concluded by asking him this question.
And as we come to the end of the programme, Minister, I often think, I'm not going to ask you the details of NAMA. I'm not going to ask you the details.
No,
that's not for today. Tuesday's prime time if you're free.
I was hoping you were going to ask me about faith rather than NAMA. But
no, I'm not. But it's a question.
That's an act of faith.
It's a kind of a question which I often want to ask in prime time, but it's not appropriate, which is that when you're making big decisions like NAMA and when you're going to stand up in the Dáil on December the 9th and introduce your budget, is there a huge pressure, a huge weight on your shoulders of the magnitude of the decisions you are taking? Because literally at this moment in time in Ireland, our entire future almost rests on your shoulders.
Well, yes, it is a great responsibility, but you have to study the facts. You have to consult widely with as many people as you can, and you have to make decisions. And really, it's as simple as that. Going back to the Latin, of course, faith, credere, is the Latin for credit, and belief and faith are bound up with money as well as religion and God. People have to have trust, and of course the big economic problem in the last few years is that trust has broken down.
But how do you know you're right? Like, I often think that sometimes when, say, I interview you in prime time, you say, are you absolutely sure you're right? And I don't want the details of NAMA. How do you know when your decision is right? Do you just have to go with it in the end?
But you read the papers, the papers that are presented to you in the department, but you don't just confine yourself to that. You look at the literature, you consult with people, you hear their view, and you form a view, and you give a lead. You have to. I mean, the alternative is to sit back and let events take their course. You have to try and guide events in the right direction. And I haven't had time to think about whether I have a burden on my shoulders. I mean, it's very interesting from a political point of view, because living through a crisis is very interesting. I've thought of it more like the French Revolution, and the one thing that's come back to me in the last year is the sense of what individuals like Danton or Robespierre must have lived through as they made decisions. Admittedly, they had to execute people and change the nature of a state and a government, and it's not quite the same. But there's this sense of a living crisis all the time, and that you're trying to cope and lead a way through it. It's revolutionary.
Does that make
in that
you
sense.
personally very stressed?
No, not at all.
In fact, can I say, I think it makes him very strong.
Yeah.
And I actually think he's, you know, the old saying, they say in rural Ireland, God made the shoulders for the job.
Within weeks of that interview, Brian Lenihan was to learn of some very serious issues about his health. And much of this book, now published, is concerned with the extraordinary turn in his career when at Christmas in 2009 he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. That news, to his dismay, was announced before he made any official announcement by TV3, and on January the 4th he was interviewed by Sean O'Rourke on RTE Radio 1.
Well, I had a pain in my stomach for a few weeks before the budget, and I was concerned about it, though I thought it was muscular. I went in for tests in the Mater Hospital after the budget, a few days after the budget. I'd had an acute onset of jaundice, a very rapid onset of jaundice, and the doctors examined what was wrong with me, and they established that there was a blockage in my pancreas. They inserted a stent, so my pancreas is working normally, but the blockage did comprise cancerous tissue, which will require medical intervention. It will require chemotherapy, it will require radiotherapy. They're not able to operate on it at this stage because it's very close to a blood vessel. So all of that, of course, was a great shock to me when I heard about it, as any of these things are to anyone who's had a warning of this type. And I will have to adjust my lifestyle and set my priorities in terms of tackling this illness, but I am in a position to continue to tackle my work as well. Of course, I discussed the matter with my own family in the first instance and discussed it with them at length. And I have to say that I'm philosophical about life, and I'm a great believer in looking at the positive side of things, and I decided I would battle it and deal with it. And I don't think really it's a matter that requires much elaboration.
What about telling the Taoiseach?
Yes, I went to the Taoiseach as soon as I was released from the hospital, and I explained the position, and he was very upset to hear of my bad news. But he indicated to me that he was anxious that if I could see my way to continuing to serve, I would. And I weighed up the options. Naturally, you have to look at the position here in the department and ensure that the country is served fully. So I consulted with my doctors and inquired as to whether I would be in a position to do that, given the treatment I'm now going to receive. The treatment starts later this week, and my doctors assured me I would be able to fulfil the duties of the office. I'm glad I had some time to explain to my family. I had always intended to make a statement now because it is of public interest, the medical condition of the Minister for Finance. I don't have an issue about that.
Right. How have people reacted to this news, whether they got it from you or heard about it on television or read about it in the papers?
Well, I'm overwhelmed by the degree of public goodwill that has been expressed to me. I very much appreciate it, and the number of individuals who mentioned that they're remembering me in their prayers or in their thoughts, and I very much appreciate that, and I hope in the work I do in the months ahead and in the years ahead, please God, that I can repay that goodwill by serving to the best of my abilities in the job I'm in. I think mental disposition is very important with all of these conditions. I was glad to learn that the rest of my body is in a very good shape.
The term that you used to describe your illness, can it be described as pancreatic cancer or cancer of the pancreas? I mean, what are your doctors saying about that?
Well, they've described the fact that there's cancerous tissue at the entrance to my pancreas. Now, beyond that, I'm not going to go to a medical textbook to elaborate on that. I think it's clear enough. It's a growth, and it's a growth I intend to defeat, or it'll defeat me.
Throughout a half-hour interview, he remained optimistic. No self-pity, as so many of the contributors to this book emphasise in their recollections of their talking with Brian Lenihan about his illness at that time.
Well, I could face a programme of up to 6 months, which with regular dosages every fortnight. That's the type of plan that's envisaged. But again, I know my doctors will keep that under review.
But it's a very difficult time for us who worked with them as well.
This is Cathy Herbert, former journalist and broadcaster, who has a chapter in this book about working closely with Brian Lenihan when he was challenged by that health crisis.
And he was immensely entertaining and humorous, and he had a huge appetite for work. And when the rest of us were ready to fall down, he'd keep us going. He kept us going as much as we him.
I remember being quite daunted that day in January of last year, going in to interview a minister at a time of national crisis about an illness that he knew would either defeat him or he would defeat it, and being nervous about how far one could press the personal issues. And he actually said to you, look, tell him to ask anything he wants.
Absolutely. And I remember we had that thing about the hair loss, and whether that would be. He said, anything, tell him to ask anything he wants. I'm ready for him to answer anything. And I was absolutely gobsmacked that day by that interview, and I'd sat in on lots of interviews, but the bravery he showed and the stoicism and the intelligence with which he spoke about the whole thing, and his sense of accountability, that he had to be accountable to the people because of that.
And back to that interview of January the 4th, 2010.
The only reason, Minister, that you and I are having this conversation is because you occupy one of the most important offices of state at a time of great crisis. Now, in those circumstances, the citizens will feel entitled to reassurance that if you're going to remain in that office, you're going to be able to carry out your duties properly.
Absolutely, and that's why I'm here today. First of all, of course, I will be here at my office in the department, supervising the work of my staff, examining the submissions they're making to me, deciding on those submissions, dealing with my correspondence, meeting delegations relevant to the work. In addition to that, I will be attending the government meetings, preparing for them and attending them and participating in the work of the government. I will also be accountable to Dáil Éireann, as every minister should be, and answer any questions that may be asked there in relation to the performance of my duties. In addition to all of that, of course, I represent the constituency of Dublin West. That's something I will continue to attend to, and I will also be available for media interviews. One thing I won't be in a position to do is to accept invitations for speaking engagements all over the country. I will have to curtail that because clearly there is a risk of infection when you're on a programme of treatment of this type, and you can't expose yourself to large numbers of people, so I won't be doing that.
You've given a fairly comprehensive summary of the duties that you feel you will be able to continue undertaking, but arguably the last thing this country needs right now is a part-time Minister for Finance, and that's what you presumably will have to be for at least a period.
No, I don't see myself as a part-time minister. I see myself as a minister who will focus on the essential constitutional functions of the job. You know yourself, in politics there's a great deal of gallivanting around taking place on the part of all politicians, and it goes with the nature of politics. I won't be gallivanting around, but I'll probably have rather more time to work in my department and work at my desk than I normally would have. So I'm satisfied I can give this job the full attention it requires. There is no budget planned this year. There's no emergency budget. It's clear from the economic statistics that there's no danger of an emergency budget, and that we will have a budget later in the year, in December next. In that sense, the first half of the year is a quieter period in this department than the second half of the year, and that is of advantage to me, obviously. But I will certainly have plenty of time to supervise my civil servants and to make difficulties for other ministers and to ensure that the budget is implemented.
Did you consider at all the idea of withdrawing from public life, say for a few months, to allow you to be treated and to recover on the basis that either the job would slow down your recovery or that your treatment might inhibit your capacity to do the job?
Well, I don't want to go into all the detail of this, but of course I would have considered that. I mean, that was one of the options I had to examine. And again, I discussed the matter with the Taoiseach and with my medical advisors. And I think when you're facing a challenge of this type, it often is better that you maintain your work and your work pattern, albeit, as I said, that I can't do the intensity of gallivanting that goes along with a lot of political life. I won't be in a position to do that, but I will be positioned to do my job. I will be in a position and my job both as a minister and as a deputy for my constituency of Dublin West.
But the treatment, presumably, based on what one reads about it, is going to be quite debilitating at times.
There are times when it will be debilitating, I accept that, but it doesn't impair your mental capacities or your intellectual capacities. I think that's the crucial issue there.
And you're not going to, as you say, go gallivanting around in the normal manner of a politician, but at the same time, everywhere you appear, when you appear in the Dáil, when you appear, maybe you might do some functions, people are going to be looking at you and say, God, he's looking well, he's losing weight, he's not looking well, or he's putting on weight, or his hair is thinning, or he's losing it. I mean, is that not all going to be one massive distraction?
Well, it is a distraction, but it's a distraction that's not going going to distract me. I'll be totally focused on doing my job and on organising my own personal health recovery. I'm not going to be distracted by a comment. And really, in relation to the TV3 issue, for example, I've certainly put that behind me. I'm not that concerned about it in a personal sense. I think there are important issues there for media organisations to reflect on. I know there's a press ombudsman, and the question of respect for privacy in relation to medical matters is an important issue, but it's not a debate I'm going to get involved in. I'm going to focus on the essentials.
That interview was fully 30 minutes in length, and this is how it concluded.
And whatever budget is produced next December will further assist that process of economic recovery.
Minister, finally, you said of the economy and the budget that the worst is over, we've turned the corner. I think I could speak for our listeners in saying we hope to hear soon from your doctors that you too have turned the corner with your own health.
Thanks very much.
But that was not to be. Little more than 12 months later, that government lost power. Brian Lenihan was the only Fianna Fáil TD in Dublin City, indeed the only Fianna Fáil TD within the Pale to survive the 2011 election. And in June 2011, Brian Lenihan died.
He was a lovely man, really a lovely man, did great work for the area.
His constituents in Dublin West.
I was only speaking to him here in the shop about a week and a half ago, wishing him well, and he said at least the pressure was off not getting a big job, you know, and I'm up here now 28 years and I knew his daddy. Really sorry to see such a young man. I really am upset.
Very shocking news, and I know he was quite ill, and he did an awful lot for our area.
Like his dad. Look, a super guy.
His father was brilliant, and he took after him.
Yeah, I'm very sad to hear about the death of Brian. I think he was a great man, did great work for the country. Probably made some mistakes, but at the back of his mind, he had an interest in the country at heart.
Shocked, it was expected, but when it comes like anything like that, it's an awful shock, because no matter what side of politics you're on, everybody admired what he did.
It's very sad actually to listen to that interview there, because you realise just how public a public person has to be. There's another person in the country would have to talk about their health in such detail, and yet he knew it was the right thing to do.
His friend and former cabinet colleague Mary Hannafin when Brian Lenihan died in June 2011.
At no stage did Brian Lenihan miss a cabinet meeting, be late for a meeting, not go to a European meeting. He attended to every single duty that would be expected of a Minister for Finance, despite the fact that he was battling such a serious illness, because he knew that the interests of the country were much larger than his own interests. And he gave it that time and he gave it that energy. And as everybody knows, the meetings were very long, the nights were long, the decisions to be made were very, very difficult, and yet he attended to them all.
All cabinet ministers work hard.
Another cabinet colleague, Green Party leader John Gormley.
So when you'd ring Brian on a Sunday, when you'd get a slight break, he would be working on these papers, and that was a mark of the man. He was someone who was absolutely dedicated, had a sense of public duty and a sense of patriotism, and I do hope that history will be kind to him. I'm sure it will, because when people reflect on those terrible times, they'll see that this was a man who did everything he could to actually assist this country.
But I do think that, when the history of the crisis is written...
Former General Secretary of Fianna Fáil, Pat Farrell.
Brian Lenihan will have an honoured place in terms of the role he played, because, the reality is we can all be very wise in hindsight, and these were very, very much uncharted waters, and he absolutely rose to the challenge. He made the very best decisions as he saw them at the time, based on the information that was available.
But I think we shouldn't forget the man either.
Another former cabinet colleague, Mary Coughlin.
He was convivial and charming. He loved people. He had, you'd always think he came from Roscommon as opposed to Dublin. He had a great affinity with my own county, having many holidays here in Donegal, and of course his mother having family here. So he was someone who was, from a convivial point of view, wonderful company, great storyteller, and loved meeting people. And regardless of who you were, they were so important to him. And I think that's a great memory of a wonderful man. And as I said, his illness was something that he really took by the scruff of the neck and really threw himself into his work. We oftentimes, I heard Mary Hannafin say, we used to worry about the fact that he was doing too much.
Brian, of the people that I'd left behind, Brian was the closest to me of that group.
Former Taoiseach and Fianna Fáil leader Bertie Ahern.
He came to me regularly. He came to my house. We had lengthy discussions about what was going on, and he kindly kept me briefed on a lot of those things. And I think sometimes maybe sounded my views, though he was well informed because he had so many people from all quarters, home and abroad, giving him advice.
He was engaging. He was charming. He was clever, like his father.
Joan Burton was Labour spokesman on finance when Brian Lenihan was minister, and of course she's a constituency colleague.
And I can say this: he never lost his, if you like, humour and courtesy, innate courtesy and dignity with people.
He was, as others have said, an extraordinary individual in many respects.
Former Taoiseach Brian Cowan, who appointed Brian Lenihan as Minister for Finance.
He had a wonderful positive philosophy in life. He was faced that adversity as he faced others. He never allowed it to in any way compromise his ability to do his job.
When you became Taoiseach, you opted for him as your finance minister, even though he was relatively inexperienced as a full cabinet minister. He was Minister for Justice, I think, for less than a year, or just about a year thereabouts. Why did you go for him as opposed to somebody maybe with more experience?
Because he had tremendous capacity. His intellectual capacity was second to none. He had a great, as I say, understanding of the workings of the institutions of state. He had a great understanding of politics, and his motivation at all time was to serve this state and to serve the interests of the country and to serve the public interest. That never meets with unanimous approval, but I think the constancy of his motivation is testimony to the sincerity of his vocation as a politician and as a statesman. And I always knew, and we all could see, anyone who knew Brian Lenihan knew that he was a man of high intellectual ability. He very well read. He wore his learning lightly, but he was also totally committed to politics. And he's one of in a line of distinguished members of his family who had that trait throughout their public careers.
Brian Cowan concluding that feature on Brian Lenihan, who is the subject of a book published this week, Brian Lenihan in Calm and Crisis, edited by Brian Murphy, Mary O'Rourke and Noel Whelan, and it's from the Marion Press.